Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. One of my main joys in doing this podcast is to have old friends come back again. Someone who I worked with a bunch during the COVID years. Dr. Terri Givens is back today. She's a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia. She's also written books, Radical Empathy, among others. Terri, welcome back to the podcast.
It's great to be back. It's fun to see you.
Yeah, it's crazy that it was like 5 years ago when we first met. You appeared on Trending in Ed a couple times, and then we had the audacity. Well, you had the audacity already, and then I helped, add to the audacity of doing a weekly show, This Week in Higher Ed, which was a pretty crazy time in higher ed. And as things turned out, it's crazy again. What's old is new again. But can you catch folks up on who you are and what you've been up to lately?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, my book, Radical Empathy, came out in actually 2021, but I'd already been working for several years on issues in higher education. I've been a provost, I've been a vice provost, a dean, et cetera. And so in the fall of 2021, I started at McGill University and actually was hired in part to help them with their strategy to address anti-Black racism. So as a Black professor who's done a lot of work in so many different things,
Right.
They were happy to have me. And it was really a great experience working with both in the, being back as a professor in the Department of Political Science, but also working with the administration, which had a clear commitment to hiring and supporting Black faculty. And so I did that for 2 years in the provost's office. And then my last year at McGill, I was in the Faculty of Arts Dean's office working on their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And I continued to help with hiring Black faculty, but then I needed to be closer to family in Seattle and on the West Coast more generally, and got a nice offer from the University of British Columbia. And so I've just been there since July, and there I am focusing on being a professor again. But,
Nice.
I can't stop doing a lot of the other stuff I do. I'm still doing a lot of consulting, and the Radical Empathy is still out there getting a lot of interest. I've done many, many talks, and so that continues.
Yeah. And I saw you were getting involved with like inclusive leadership, great follow on LinkedIn or Facebook. You're putting a lot of stuff out into the world on the regular. And, it's certainly a pretty chaotic time and a lot of disruption within higher ed. One of the things we wanted to talk about today is an article you wrote on LinkedIn about academic associations and how they're facing challenges, and you have some thoughts on that. So maybe we could go there next.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that what's happening in higher ed has a domino effect. And a lot of people have been focusing on what's happening at universities, which is huge, right? I mean, they're losing their research funding, they're losing international students, and this is an issue both in the United States and Canada.
Yeah.
What people don't understand is the importance of academic associations, right? And I've been a volunteer in, American Political Science Association, International Studies,
Yeah.
Various European studies
You're like
associations.
You're kind of like the anti-Groucho Marx. You belong to many clubs. Yes.
Yes, I do. And I think they're extremely important, right? Because one of the things we all know is you have to publish. Well, those publications are usually started through, people you meet at these association meetings, the annual conferences. Also, you present your work there, and that counts towards, things like tenure and promotion.
Yep.
You need to, get to know the people who are going to be judging you when it comes to tenure and promotion. These associations play an integral role in, basically helping us move forward as academics. And somebody who's been involved in the governance of several of these organizations, what I've seen is that they're not necessarily prepared for the different challenges that, they have and will continue to face, and that are becoming even more challenging.
Yeah.
So, we know that there's a decline in tenured faculty, right? People on the tenure track, and it's becoming an adjunct focused. Basically, all of higher ed is becoming more adjunct focused.
Yeah. I like to say there's adjunctification of higher ed. Yeah.
Absolutely. Adjunctification is real. And so there's fewer people to be members. These associations rely on membership. You have people paying into it and going to the conferences and paying for the conferences.
Yeah.
And, there's constant complaining about how much the membership fees cost. And yet, the members themselves don't understand how that's becoming more and more of a challenge. And just getting members and, keeping them and getting them to go to the conferences because, funding is on the decline. I
Mhm.
mean, I remember when I started out as a faculty member, you get a little bit of money every year to go to conferences. Well, that money hasn't really increased. I mean,
Yeah.
you look at professional development funds, people are getting like, $1,000. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was at University of Texas at Austin, I would blow my professional development funds with going to maybe one conference a year. So
Right.
a lot of times faculty are taking money out of their own pocket to go to
Hmm.
these conferences, and that's kind of a tax, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and of course, the faculty who don't have the money are the ones who are lower paid. It's like, the higher paid you are, the more likely you are to get research funds and research assistants and all these different things.
Hmm.
And so it's unfortunately a cycle. But, on the other hand, the associations themselves are trying to do more in terms of, expanding their offerings to make it more helpful for people, community colleges,
Yep.
adjuncts, all these, we have the different tiers of Research One, Research Two institutions. And so I think, they are doing their best to try and address it. But when crises come up, like the fact that you might be having your conference outside of the US and people who are on visas in the US don't feel
Right.
like they can leave the country, right? So
Right.
what do you
Hmm.
do? And, it's difficult to say, oh, well, we'll just go online. Well,
Yeah.
that's very difficult as we found out
Hmm.
during COVID. So we're almost, in a way, in a similar moment as COVID when it comes to higher education.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping to get these associations to collaborate. And it's not just, the fact that there's less money to go around. It's also that the members themselves are demanding more from these associations in terms of taking political stances, which most
Yeah.
of them can't because they're
Right.
501(c)(3s.
Hmm.
They want them to cancel conferences when there's labor conflict. There's all these different things that have come up. And I think it's, they need to all, at least understand who's doing what. They're kind of working in their own silos.
Right.
And we've talked about this before, even in the context of small colleges, right? Or,
Yes. I remember calling them SPLACs,
yeah.
small private liberal arts colleges. Yes, I remember that.
Yes, and unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of those closing.
Hmm.
And my goal, because I'm very supportive of these organizations, and I want to see them become more collaborative,
Hmm.
so that they can be more proactive when it comes to they need to have strategic plans that are looking forward. Part of the problem is leadership is always members, right? Faculty who have taken on these volunteer positions.
Yeah.
And, they don't necessarily understand how a 501(c)(3) works or how
Right.
to be a good board member. You give them their binder, but they don't read it. I know because I don't read mine.
Yeah.
But I've worked long enough. I mean, I've literally been the board chair of a 501(c)(3, in my
Yep.
community here in California. I mean, I've got all these different layers of experience,
Hmm.
and, I'm hoping to be able to offer that to a broader range of associations
Hmm.
so that they can learn from each other. It's creating, it's kind of like the whole issue of economies of scale that I was going
Yes.
after with the SPLACs, as you call them,
Yes.
is let's
Yes.
create some economies of scale
Yep.
that allow, a bunch of organizations to have to spend less time and less money on
Hmm.
these adjustments and do more for their members, right? I mean, my
Right.
ultimate goal is for these associations to be able to do more for their members because I am one of them and I want
Hmm.
them to be able to do more for me and I want them to survive. And we need to be constantly rethinking what are the next steps given the current environment in higher education. They are not independent entities that can just say, oh, look at what's
Right.
happening. No, they have direct investment and are directly involved in what is happening in higher education.
Yeah. And it's a time when there's a lot of hollowing out of institutions, whether it's, the federal government in the US or it's at the individual university level. The funds aren't there, especially if you don't have a big endowment. You're completely dependent on enrollment, and the numbers are not always easy to manage. And that's certainly the case when it comes to associations. How do you think about, more as a political scientist? Because, I remember actually your book on the roots of racism was a really
Mhm.
great conversation that we had as well. I'll include links to Terry's Trending in Ed All-Star List lineup in the show notes. You have a deep understanding of this stuff. I certainly was relying on you back when stuff was first hitting. Now that we're 4 or 5 years downstream from there, COVID's in our rearview mirror. DEI is understood very differently based on the current political landscape. How would you assess where we are today, and, any thoughts on like the right mental models and sort of frameworks to be relying on to kind of power through what may be a challenging period here?
Well, I think it boils down to the ways that, most immigrant communities and the Black community has survived up until now.
Yeah.
This country has always been problematic
Yep.
for particular groups, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so what's interesting is seeing, kind of our allies finally understanding, oh, we've known all this stuff has been there all along. This is
Right.
why we have things
Right.
like diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
We've had to create laws because we know
Right.
that underlying all of this is systemic racism and discrimination. And it's not just Black people. It's, the first people who are getting deported are, Venezuelans and
Yep.
people from Mexico and Cuba and all these other places,
Hmm.
and especially I know the Cubans have to be up in arms because a lot of them voted for Trump and
Yep.
they, expected him not to go after, he was supposed to go after the criminals, but he's
Right.
going after everybody because he
Yeah.
has, he's got this number in mind and he has to get his quota.
Right.
So the issue is how do we start to develop mutual aid? And I really believe that, this is why I've always worked at the local level in my communities, right? I've
Hmm.
always, going back, to when I was in college at Stanford, and I live right next door to Stanford, and when I'm not in Vancouver these days. And that's why, when I was in Austin, Texas, I was on so many different boards, including, public television. So what it means is people who have privilege and means need to be stepping up.
Hmm.
Right. And I was listening to, what's going on with Trump and the Middle East and so on. And I'm like, okay, that stuff is happening. And unfortunately, I wish these CEOs would step up and, try to get this guy to, stop what
Yeah.
he's doing.
Assert some of their political will. Yes.
They're all about getting their stock prices up and
Yep.
getting those billion-dollar contracts. And,
Mhm.
I can't blame them, right? I mean, they have workers who need to live and so on. But I mean, the ultimate reality is, yeah, they can get that work, but we're all going to be hurt by what's happening right now, no matter what,
Yeah.
because it's impacting everybody. And so those who are, still working, still have resources and so on, need to step up and start. I'm going to be talking with a friend at Stanford this afternoon to
Hmm.
talk about. Who's a researcher who's losing her research funding. I want to figure out ways that Black alumni can help her.
Right.
I want to figure out ways that I can start, I'm going to start talking to my congressman here to see if we can start talking about, again, it's collaboration, creating,
Right.
I'm big on not having people stuck in silos.
Right.
And I really think it's important that we break down those silos, get organization. I mean, I tried to do this when I was the provost just down the street here at Menlo College, is to
Right.
get the different nonprofits that were working with college-bound low-income students to talk to each other and work together.
Right.
We had
Hmm.
meetings and that was really helpful. The problem is we had a lot of turnover of executive directors. And
Yeah.
so we need people higher up, like, the people who can rally community resources at a higher level to then create structures so that if we lose an executive director, you don't lose the knowledge that, oh, we have this group. And, I'm glad to see now that a lot of the groups that I was involved in are doing that they're working
Hmm.
together, that they're creating the structures. But then you look at, the San Francisco Bay Area, Chan Zuckerberg, they're, pulling back their funding for charitable organizations,
Right.
so somebody has to fill that void. And, we need to get these millionaires and billionaires around here to step up and say, this is, I know, and unfortunately, this is what the Republicans and Trump want, is for private individuals to step
Privatization of
in.
everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
But that's the reality we got to deal with. And frankly, if you go back 100 years, that's what people were doing,
Yeah.
right? I mean, people were getting the wealthy to step up and pay for libraries. And,
Right.
I mean, we wouldn't have the library system we have if it weren't for, the billionaires
Yeah.
back.
Listen, Terry, I watched Gilded Age. I know how it works, you know?
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, it is a time. And then I imagine it's a time too, where people need to kind of muster their own energy and their own will to kind of, being interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, wearing different hats takes work, and it takes
Hmm.
courage, I guess, to put yourself out of, your small pond and into a different context where maybe you're not the most experienced, the most senior, the most well-known. Do you have advice for folks around that? Where I did find the focus on empathy, I think was spot on. It's still spot on
Hmm.
from what I'm hearing, like focus and empathy, particularly among the rising generations, is something that they're having trouble with. And I would say, like, we're all probably not doing the best job modeling it. But what advice would you have for folks who are concerned about this stuff and they want to do something, but they're not really sure what to do with that activation?
I've got a whole book coming out on that.
Oh, excellent. And I didn't even know that. Look at that. Yeah.
So the follow-up to radical empathy is called Reckoning, and it's basically all about taking action using empathy.
Hmm.
And so, it's really interesting because, during COVID, I got to know a lot of folks through social media, and a lot of that really helped me to develop my thinking. It's nice to have empathy. I think my first book was also really good. So also go out and get Radical Empathy because every chapter it
Yeah.
talks about how to practice empathy.
Hmm.
But this next book really looks at people who are doing, not just having empathy, but taking action.
Yeah.
And, so I'll give an example, of something I was involved in through my research. So a lot of people think, oh, my research is one thing, but, community action is different. I've always found ways to, be taking action kind of through my research. So I was studying anti-discrimination policy for years in the European Union.
Hmm.
And luckily, I was connected to the German Marshall Fund that would have these annual events, and was really interesting. This is the early 2000s, and even under Bush, they were doing work to support young people who wanted to get into public office.
Hmm.
And they would have these events every year in Brussels. They would have this event called the Brussels Forum, which is
Yeah.
for people who are in. So I went for many years to this and actually got involved with Congressman Alcee Hastings and a few other folks around supporting young people who were, destined to become. And the amazing thing is, some of them did, right? I
Yeah.
mean, we have somebody who was a state senator in Michigan. I could go down the list, but all of them, one way or another, got involved in politics.
Yep.
And that was the goal, right? Get young people interested, help them understand how to run for office, help them how to get more involved. And
Hmm.
this was not just in the US, it was a transatlantic group which still exists.
Yeah.
And so even though, this was research for me in many ways, it was also a way to get involved and support. I helped one of the attendees find a place to stay in Brussels, so they
Yeah.
didn't have to pay for hotel. And I
Hmm.
mean, it's the little things. People have to remember, it's like the butterfly flapping its wings, one thing you do could have a huge impact down the
Right.
line. And that's what I'm seeing in a lot of different ways is finding, it's a lot of work and, people see me doing all this stuff. It is a lot of work, but I also take care of myself.
Hmm.
So that's my number one priority. And also finding ways to interweave what you're doing. So, my job is to teach and to write and to do service, but I can, find ways to do that in a way that is getting me more actively involved. Like I agreed to chair our committee on, trying to raise money, for our department because of course everybody has to do this
Oh
now.
my God. Yeah.
But it's also a way for me to say, okay, I mean, I've had a year in Vancouver now. When I get back in September, I'm going to hit the ground running and
Hmm.
meet people and, start to figure out who are our alumni and how
Hmm.
do we get connected in the community. And I mean, I've laid the groundwork because I do interviews for the CBC in
Yep.
Vancouver all the time and other outlets. I've been in all the newspapers, even the national CBC. And so part of it is using our platform as political scientists to say,
Hmm.
I become an expert on Canadian politics all of a sudden.
Yeah.
At first, they were just talking to me about the U.S. election, and so now I'm like talking about McCartney's cabinet.
Right. Well, that'll come in handy when the annexation happens. No, hang on.
Yes, it can come in handy for other reasons. I did talk to them a lot about the 51st state stuff.
Oh my God. It's
Uh,
just got to be challenging too, because, you're an academic. So like there is that sense of like playing the game in terms of your rigor and showing your work so that you can sort of engage in the conversation.
Hmm.
And a lot of what's happening now is more like absurdist, frankly, where
Hmm.
like the scenarios that we're thinking about, someone who spent her career in political science probably weren't a lot of scenarios around an airplane being donated to the president by
Yes.
a foreign government that would then
Yes.
become Air Force One. It's almost like from a wargaming perspective, you're on uncharted ground.
Yes.
And
Yes.
because things are so chaotic, you almost need to adjust your frame of reference to realize it's going to be chaotic. And then within a chaotic world, how can I make an impact?
Well, the interesting thing is I started studying, my grad school work was on the radical right
Right.
in Europe, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like my whole career I've been kind of a Cassandra out there saying, hey guys, the radical right
Right.
is rising. And people are telling me, oh, they're just a flash in the pan. And then I study
Right.
immigration and I'm like, hey folks, we need comprehensive immigration reform and we need to
Right.
do it. And,
Yeah.
and then, hey folks, there's a lot of, you know, anti-Islam, Islamophobia, and it's being funded by people in the US and
Yeah.
they're supporting this in Europe and the US and we need to pay attention to this. And
Right.
it's like I feel like, and then, I see people like Octavia Butler, were writing about this in the 80s.
Right.
So it's not like, there's a connection to the fact that everybody's so, every new TV show is post-apocalyptic, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah.
there's this whole, idea that, we're heading towards this decline. And,
Hmm.
and unfortunately, some of the people in government are very much accelerationists. They just
Yeah.
want to see us, collapse. And unfortunately, we're on track for that to a certain extent. I mean, I do believe there's some resilience in the system that,
Yeah.
the fact that we're a federal system and, we can hopefully bounce back from this. But I think the reality is that we have to look to history to understand how we get through this.
Hmm.
And that's kind of my current research is kind of taking a more historical approach to understand where we are today.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about, it comes up a lot in the conversations I have, like resilience, resourcefulness, and then almost a sense of personal purpose and agency. So, like, however you can find it, but like find a lane in which you feel like you can actually do something. And then
Hmm.
ideally, kind of put some blinders on. I did listen to Chris Hayes's book, Siren's Call, which is quite good. It's about the fact that we're living in the attention age. And
Hmm.
if you spend too much time on social media responding to the chaos that's out there all the time, the extreme language and the, outrage, in some ways you lose your ability to say anything because there's so much stuff to react to all the time.
Yeah.
So it's almost a time to kind of narrow focus. You were mentioning that the idea of going local, like, is that old saw still the right way to think about it? Think
Yes.
globally, act locally.
100%. I mean, that's how you focus, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to focus on, basically the situation in both my communities in Vancouver and here in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Hmm.
And how can I help?
Yeah.
I support people, in different nonprofits. I do what I can in terms of, raising grant funds that I hope can, support people who are losing their grant funds.
Yeah.
It's, certainly not the easiest path because sometimes, like you said, you get overwhelmed and you think, oh, I need to do this and I need to do that. But the reality is, no, that's why we need to think of take the collaboration down to the level of, okay, I'm an individual. I can't do everything. But if I work with, this person and that
Hmm.
person and try to find new ways to approach issues. The good news about the US and Canada and Europe for, everywhere for that matter is this is not the first time we've been through major challenges.
Right.
Right. And that's why I think that a historical perspective is important. When things are getting bad, I think about, okay, my parents were born in, my dad was born in 1928. My mom was born in 1930.
Yeah.
Gee, let's think about what they lived through,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
And yet they still managed to have kids and, live a good life for the most part. They
Hmm.
struggled at times. My dad was in the military, but, they got through it. And, even when my dad came out of the military, it was the 70s. And one of the things I told my students, which I'm sure they don't understand, is that we're heading into a 70s style recession.
Mhm.
And how do we get through that? And, it's not for those of us who lived through it, well, you don't buy as much.
Right.
You try to do what you can for your kids. It's unfortunate because what's frustrating is this didn't have to happen,
Right.
as we know, but I think it's time, we have to live with it. And obviously we need to rethink politics. And I think the other component of this is to stay politically involved.
Mhm.
And that's something that I think is some people, oh, I don't want to be involved in politics. Everything is politics. I hate
Yeah.
to tell you.
Yeah.
And so if you say you're not involved in politics, okay, so what? You don't shop for groceries, you don't, drive a car, you don't
Yeah.
you don't have streets in front of your house
Right.
and
Or school. I
sidewalks
mean,
and
schools have
yeah,
become
schools
a front
is
line on the
absolutely.
culture
I mean,
war.
so, don't tell me you're not political or involved in politics. Every aspect of your life is political.
Yeah.
And, I mean, if you think about politics as policy, especially. So I think the important thing is for people to understand that every single aspect of their life is political and that they need to be talking to I know politicians right now are getting overwhelmed with all the emails and calls, but that's important. The marches are important.
Mhm.
I'm wearing my old Women's March shirt today.
Nice. Nice.
That stuff is important.
Mhm.
And, I know a lot of Black women who, voted 92% for Harris. They're like, we did our job. So
Yeah.
it's time for y'all to do your job.
Yeah.
But, me, I have to stay active. So
Yeah.
I think that the overwhelm is absolutely there. But, look at what your local representative is doing. Even though I have a Democrat he's a new, I want to help him. I've been pestering him about having online. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to make it to any of his town halls, but he's getting good attendance.
Good.
I'm pestering him on social media all the time. He probably hates me,
Yeah.
but I haven't. I'm gonna set up see if I can meet him the next time he's here in town, which they should have their summer recess coming up.
Yeah.
So try to set up a meeting with your local representative. Ask them what you can do to
Yeah.
help them, and not just money. It's like, them, stop asking me for money. When you get a good strategy, I'll send you money.
Right.
Now they're like, oh, we have a strategy, send us money. I'm like, well, I haven't seen it.
Yeah, there's a few $1 billion that were spent perhaps questionably, but this is not an overly political podcast. It's this one because you're here. We're going political because, as you mentioned,
I'm a political scientist. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, and it's also education exists in political context, to your point. I'm talking to Dr. Terri Givens, who is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Lots going on. It's great to have you back. It was wonderful doing pods with you back in the day. Any thoughts on, maybe what you learned? It sounds like you were on some things that were on the horizon. You kind of saw stuff coming, but, you mentioned the Cassandra thing. Cassandra, I'm not sure she was right. So you may be slightly different from Cassandra, but like, what lessons have you taken from the last, say, 5 years? It's been a pretty wild ride.
I think the biggest thing I've taken from it is that higher ed was not prepared for, even though there have been people talking about this for years and years and years, they were not prepared for the decline in enrollment.
Hmm.
They were not proactive about it. They have not really focused enough, as I tried to do years ago, on developing leadership.
Hmm.
And, it was almost embarrassing watching some of these university presidents get in front of Congress. And I'm like,
Right.
what's going on? Why aren't
Yeah.
these people prepared? I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy to me that they weren't prepared to go in front of Congress to defend what they were doing in their
Right.
universities.
Yeah.
And these are very intelligent people.
Yeah.
And so that was really surprising to me. On the good side, I've seen a lot being done around, we could spend another hour talking about AI. I know you've
Yeah.
been doing that already.
Yeah.
The impact of AI, there's a lot of people doing great work around this. Brian Alexander
Yeah.
has been very visionary. I mean, that's what he does. He's a futurist, but still, he's somebody to keep an eye on in terms of just kind of tracking trends.
Yeah.
And then, I think the biggest thing is higher ed still hasn't figured out how to explain its value.
Hmm.
And
Right.
I see people talking about this all the time as well, is that we have done a very, very poor job of explaining why things like a liberal education are important.
Mm.
And more, students are focused on, grades and, what kind of job they're going to get versus, the fact that education is an end in and of itself.
Mm.
And so that's still very frustrating. But, I'm seeing a lot more diversity in higher education, which is great. And not just, in terms of gender and race. It's, you're seeing a lot of shifts happening. But another frustrating side of that is that we're getting, the 60-40 female male thing
Yeah.
is just getting worse.
Yeah.
And we need to focus more on, and, again, there was no proactive works being done on this, but we need to understand why young men are either choosing or aren't able to get into college.
Yeah.
And that's a K through 12 issue.
Hmm.
Higher ed is doing what they can, but if kids are dropping out or not choosing, whatever it has happening, I'm not an expert on this. I just see it
Yeah.
that this is an urgent issue and we need to do
Yeah.
something about it.
Yeah. And even the politicization of higher ed, where it's now
Mm.
become, the positioning of higher ed as being sort of a leftist, you
Which
know,
is totally wrong. I
yeah.
mean, higher ed is not, most of us, are moderate at best.
Yeah.
Every political science department I've been in has its fair share of conservatives.
Yeah.
And, I'm not even that left, no matter how you look at it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. My research is in realms where it's not a left or right issue, right?
Hmm.
My research is in realms of understanding. I studied the radical right in the
Yeah.
broader context of electoral systems. I mean, people are coming to me now to talk about the Canadian system because of all the strategic voting. I mean, that's what my research was about, was strategic voting.
Hmm.
And so, there's no indoctrination going on. I can tell you, we professors wish we could indoctrinate our students because if we
Yeah.
could, it would be to just say, focus on, what you're learning, not what you get out of it. I mean,
Mm.
what you get out of it is important, but what you get out of it is not necessarily, directly connected to a job. And to be fair, I've done a lot of the work, figuring out, okay, if you get a poli-sci degree, here's, the things you can get into or, whatever. So I'm not against that. I'm just
Mhm.
saying that we need to better understand how to help students see the connection and, make the connections between what they're doing and how that's going to help them in life, not just a career.
Mhm.
So anyway, I think the underlying theme here is just that everything we do is kind of a collaboration, and
Mm.
the politicization of higher ed is just to me an indicator that yet again we need more collaboration, and it's happening. I mean, AAC&U is finally pulling the university presidents together
Yep.
to, and some aren't, necessarily coming into that group, but even if they aren't, I think that universities are finally seeing the importance of standing together,
Mm.
supporting each other, finding ways for the less resourced universities and colleges to find economies of scale,
Mhm.
to support each other in research, all these different things. And, I'm hopeful, crossing my fingers,
Yeah.
this will be a moment, and I'm always trying to think hopefully and in a positive way that, it's not necessarily bad to be, involved in the political side of things, but that we see this as a way to really promote the positives that we are doing in higher education and that we do it in a collaborative way that, I mean, most people want to send their kids to college.
Yeah.
Well, that's the dream, but somehow that dream has become disconnected from the professors and the people, the staff, everybody at a university campus that is doing this work.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how that disconnect happened because, there was a funny meme out there, this guy was saying, "Oh, college is," I can't remember, "college is bad." And then showing a picture of him with his daughter-in-law who just got a master's degree. "Oh, look how great it's like,
Yeah.
these people want to send their kids to college and they all went to, Harvard and Yale and
Yeah.
Princeton and Stanford and all that. And yet now they're going to turn around and say college is bad.
Yeah.
And it's just, hypocritical in many ways. And so we need to find a way to, tap into people's kind of desire for their kids to be able to go to college and what that means, and help them understand the connection to, look, we are the people who are doing the work.
Hmm.
And, if you want your kid to be a great researcher someday, or if you want to be a beneficiary of that research,
Hmm.
we need to support our universities and colleges.
Amazing stuff here with Terri Givens. So as we conclude here, Terri, any parting shots, any final words as we wrap up? First off, I'd love to get you back on more on the regular. It was nice doing this somewhat routinely. So hopefully we'll be seeing more of you again. This is just the beginning, but any parting shots on your way out here?
Just that I think it's important to not just look at what's going on in the US, but kind of take a more global perspective.
Yeah.
I think we have a tendency, oh, it's so horrible. But I mean, lots of countries are dealing with similar challenges. And, I think we need to reflect, like I said, not only on history, but on what's going on in the rest of the world, and how we can, learn from what is going on in other places.
Yeah. Amazing stuff. And track your experts, find folks like Terri to keep track of what's going on in the world around you, and then hopefully check in with them from time to time to stay sharp. Terri, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
It's my pleasure.
And for our listeners, if you like what you heard, please write us reviews, tell your friends. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.